Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and unravel one of the absolute most perplexing economic and social mysteries on the African continent today. We're looking at Equatorial Guinea. It's a country of really striking contrasts, immense natural beauty, and a deeply, deeply complicated history. Today, we're going to explore exactly how a nation can be incredibly resource-rich, yet still struggle so much to pass that prosperity down to its everyday citizens.
Now look at this staggering number right here. $13,600. This was Equatorial Guinea's soaring GDP per capita back in 2007. To put that into perspective, an economic surge of that magnitude effectively pushed the nation into the ranks of middle-income countries, at least on paper. For a time, it was actually the fastest-growing economy in the entire world, and that growth was driven entirely by the discovery of vast offshore oil reserves.
But here is the crucial catch, and it's a big one. Despite that massive, explosive macroeconomic wealth, an astonishing 75% of the population survives on less than $10 a day. Even worse, over 30% live in extreme poverty, scraping by on less than $2 a day. This super stark contrast between national wealth and individual poverty is exactly what economists call the paradox of plenty. So how exactly does a nation become one of Africa's richest on paper while its citizens face such extreme poverty? Well, let's start by looking at the land itself.
Section 1. The Paradox of Plenty, a Divided Geography. The country has this really unique physical and cultural split. It's almost like a giant puzzle with two completely separate pieces. First, you've got Bioko. That's a mountainous, volcanic island sitting off the coast, which houses the capital city of Malabo and is the ancestral home of the Bubi people. Then, entirely separated by the ocean, you have Rio Muni over on the mainland. That area is characterized by dense rainforests and coastal plains, and it's predominantly home to the Fang people. This sheer geographical isolation between the island and the mainland historically nurtured very distinct, totally separate cultures.
And get this, setting it even further apart from its neighbors, this is actually Africa's only Spanish-speaking nation. While surrounding countries heavily reflect French or British colonial influences, Equatorial Guinea's linguistic identity is a direct result of a really complex and quite often brutal Spanish colonial past.
Which brings us to the next part of our explainer, the Spanish colonial era and the roots of exploitation.
To truly understand today's economic paradox, we really have to trace the origins of how the nation's resources were first extracted by outsiders. If we map out the rapid sequence of events here, in 1778, Spain acquired Bioko, which was then called Fernando Po, from Portugal. By 1844, full-scale colonization of the mainland, Rio Muni, had kicked off. This colonial period lasted all the way until independence in 1968, which unfortunately just paved the way for a really turbulent late 20th century, including a major coup in 1979 and that transformational discovery of oil in the 1990s.
So the absolutely crucial point to take away here is that the Spanish established a rigid blueprint of exploitation. They didn't just govern, they extracted. Heavy timber logging literally stripped the Rio Muni forests, while incredibly lucrative cacao plantations were set up on Bioko. And to maintain control, the colonial authorities deliberately used divide-and-rule tactics. They empowered select local elites while straight-up criminalizing traditional booby practices. That introduced a deep, structural inequality to native societies that honestly had no previous experience with such rigid hierarchies.
Moving on to independence and dictatorship.
You know, you'd think this new era of independence would bring the freedom and prosperity the population had so desperately hoped for. But unfortunately, it really didn't. Following the 1968 independence, the very first president, Francisco Macias Nguema, plunged the country into a horrific period of political violence. His regime was characterized by mass executions, public torture, and the rounding up of political opponents. It was an era of extreme isolation that completely shattered the nascent civil society and forced a massive exodus of not just the Spanish, but thousands of Equatorial Guineans too.
Then, in 1979, Macias was overthrown in a coup by his own nephew, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Basogo. But really, this simply replaced one dictator with another. As noted in source reports by observers, Obiang basically cemented a system of severe repression that controls pretty much all aspects of civil life, utilizing intimidation as a fundamental instrument to legitimize and maintain his grip on power.
Fast forward to the modern political landscape, and the mechanisms of this control are incredibly stark. Since multi-party systems were ostensibly introduced in the 1990s, the ruling party, the PDGE, has maintained absolute dominance.
Despite the facade of having elections, which, by the way, international observers consistently brand as fraudulent, organizations like the UN regularly report widespread human rights abuses, arbitrary arrests, and the aggressive silencing of any political dissent.
Okay, let's shift gears to the resource curse. Let's dive into the economic transformation that changed literally everything for the regime, but incredibly little for the everyday people on the ground. Just look at the sheer explosion of wealth on the chart. In 1994, the country was producing just under 1 million barrels of oil. By 1997, literally just 3 years later, production skyrocketed to 20 million barrels. It was an astronomical windfall that brought billions of dollars flooding into a previously impoverished nation. But this right here is a textbook example of the resource curse. While the national GDP aggressively expanded from $1 billion to $18 billion, look at the devastating local impact. Agricultural spending absolutely plummeted, meaning local food production collapsed. Because they suddenly had to import food, inflation doubled. And despite billions in new oil revenue, healthcare remained chronically underfunded, leaving the country with terribly high infant mortality rates and an acute lack of basic medical supplies. To put it bluntly, the wealth was entirely captured at the very top. As this chart shows, a tiny, tiny elite, barely 1% of the population, controls 40% of the entire nation's wealth. The patronage system ensures that the massive windfall from the oil boom is distributed among a very small circle, completely bypassing the vast majority of everyday citizens. Finally, let's look at culture and conservation.
Despite all of this economic and political turbulence, Equatorial Guinea harbors some incredibly rich, yet highly threatened cultural and natural assets. The linguistic landscape here is just fascinating. It serves as a historic link between Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, and Latin America, with Spanish, French, and Portuguese all recognized as official languages. But tragically, the rich native vernacular languages and ancestral practices of the Bubi and Fang are rapidly fading. Driven by rapid urbanization and a real lack of institutional support, much of this vibrant cultural tapestry exists today only in the memories of the elderly.
Geographically, the country is also a remarkable biodiversity hotspot. Bioko Island is characterized by deep volcanic calderas and is home to really rare endemic primate species, as well as the giant grouper. Meanwhile, the Rio Muni mainland hosts untouched tropical rainforests teeming with African forest elephants. It is truly a natural heritage of global importance.
However, just as colonial timber extraction threatened the land centuries ago, these pristine ecosystems are once again right on the brink. Rapid urbanization, industrial logging without proper oversight, and modernized hunting techniques are putting immense, potentially irreversible pressure on this remarkable biodiversity.
So what does this all mean for the future? I'll leave you with this thought to take away from our explainer today. We've seen a nation defined by a really deep paradox: immense natural beauty and massive oil wealth, contrasted against stark poverty and historical oppression. The question now is, can Equatorial Guinea rewrite its narrative? Can it finally move beyond its history of exploitation, diversify its economy, and ensure that its hidden wealth actually benefits all of its citizens? Thank you so much for exploring this complex topic with me today.